Manual pools in Horizon View. Let's jump in. One of the challenges we're going to face in a view environment if we're using manual pools is that we have a certain amount of virtual machines over here in vSphere. Let's say we deployed those all using the template, so they're all perfect and ready to go. And we have a whole bunch of users that might want to use those resources, but how do we allocate those right resources, the right VMs, to the right users? And if we're using manual pools, it goes something like this. We log into the view administrator at the connection server, and we create some pools. For example, maybe we create a pool called engineering, and another pool called sales. And then once inside of view, once we've defined these pools, we then populate those pools with one or more VMs. So for example, if these VMs were numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, maybe we put VMs 1 through 3 into the engineering pool, and we put VMs 4, 5, and 6 into the sales pool. And then the last piece of this puzzle is we can go ahead and inside of Horizon View Administrator, we can specify which users or groups of users are allowed to use resources in these pools. So that is what you and I get to set up in this nugget. We are going to deploy a few virtual machines inside of vSphere, create the pools, we'll associate the VMs with those pools, and then we will entitle, that's the terminology that's used, we'll entitle various users and or groups for using the resources in those Horizon View pools. So here inside of vSphere, I've created 4 virtual machines, and probably the fastest way for us to get 4 perfect VMs up and running is, you got it, using a template and then cloning from that template. So these 4 virtual machines, 22, 23, 26, and 27, they are all up and running, they are members of the domain, and they have the Horizon View agent currently running on each one of them. And one of the big gotchas or secrets of doing manual pools is that they are manual because we had to manually create these here inside of vSphere, and then inside of Horizon View, we'll take these existing VMs and we'll allocate them to the pools that we create inside of View Administrator. Next, we get to use Horizon View Administrator by connecting to the connection server, and after logging in, we're going to go to the catalog section under inventory. We'll expand that and we'll click on desktop pools. Now by default, there are no desktop pools, but that's easily fixed, my friend, by simply clicking on add. Now we have 3 choices, and the automated desktop pool is selected by default. And an automated desktop pool is exactly what it sounds like. It will automatically create virtual machines for us. And that is a fantastic option, and we're going to cover that in a separate nugget. This nugget, however, we're going to focus on manual, which is where there's VMs already created and running. And if those machines happen to be in a vSphere environment, those are considered managed desktops. And if we were connecting to some other resource that was outside of the management of a vSphere environment, that would be referred to as an unmanaged desktop. So with manual desktop pool selected, we'll go ahead and click on next. And then we have options of dedicated or floating. Dedicated simply means that if we have a user like Bob who connects, Bob's going to be associated with a virtual machine, one of the virtual machines in the pool that he's entitled to use. And then in the future, when Bob connects again, he's going to be connected to the same exact virtual machine. And the checkbox for Enable Automatic Assignment means that we simply don't have to manually do it. Bob logs on for the first time, connects to a resource for the first time, it'll automatically associate Bob with that virtual machine, which is really handy if we're rolling out hundreds of virtual desktops. The other option, called floating, means we're simply going to be randomly given a virtual machine when we connect. So for our manual pool, we're going to be using dedicated virtual machines, and we're going to have automatic assignment. So we'll click next to continue. The next step of this wizard is asking if these are managed by vSphere or not. And the machines that we're all using are part of vSphere, so we're going to leave the radio button selected for vCenter virtual machines. And we'll click on next. Next is showing us a list of vCenter servers. Now, how did this magically get here? And the answer is, when we configured the connection server, we told it which vCenter servers it could go ahead and work with. And that's what it's populating right here. And the magic is that the connection server has an open communication line with the vCenter server. And as a result, if we need to get information from the vCenter server, or if we need to ask the vCenter server to do things for us regarding its VMs, that communication path has already been set up when we did the install of connection server. So with our single vCenter server selected, we're going to go ahead and click on next. And now we get to name our pool. So let's create the first one called engineering pool. And in our display name, we can have spaces if we want, or you could use the same exact name, that's fine too. And we could give it a description of what this pool was created for, which is, by the way, really helpful. If you have lots of pools and you can't always remember why you created that pool or who's using it, by making a little note in the description, it can be very helpful for either yourself or somebody coming after you to remember what that pool is being used for. For example, Vice President uses this pool. That might be critical information if we're trying to decide whether or not we should delete a pool or not. So with our ID and display name in place, we'll click on Next. For the state of this pool, it's either enabled or disabled. We'll leave it enabled. We can also set up additional restrictions based on tags, and we'll leave the default of none currently in place. Under remote settings, referring to the connections that our users are going to be making to the resources in this pool. Regarding power, we can say take no power action, or we could say make sure the machines are always powered on, or we could suspend the virtual machines or power off the virtual machines in this pool. And you might ask, well, how's that possible? Here we are on the connection server. Doesn't VMware vCenter control all the VMs? But remember, the connection server and vCenter are connected and talking with each other. So anything that connection server needs to have done, it's going to pass those requests over to vCenter, who can carry them out. Next, we have automatically log off after a disconnect. So for example, let's say we have a user like Bob who connects to the connection server and starts to use a virtual machine from one of the pools. Now, when Bob is done with that virtual machine, when he's done working with it, he has a couple of options. He can disconnect, which leaves him logged on to that virtual machine, simply not connected to it, or he can disconnect and log off. And the default setting is in this pool to go ahead and never automatically log off just because a user disconnected. However, if we wanted to say, you know what, if somebody disconnects for any reason, we want them to automatically log off as well, we could go ahead and say immediately, and that would be the case for resources in this pool. Or we could say, I want to go ahead and log off after, let's say, 5 minutes. So if somebody gets disconnected temporarily and they go back in within 5 minutes, they'll still have their exact same desktop in exactly the same state it was, as if they had never left. And allowing users to reset their machines really should say reboot, because that's what this controls. If you want your users to be able to reboot, go ahead and say yes on this pool, and then the VMs in this pool will allow the users to go ahead and reboot them. As we scroll down a little bit more, we have our remote display protocol. By default, we have PC over IP, or we can select Microsoft RDP. And by default, we're allowing a client to choose which of the protocols they want to use. If you don't want to allow them to choose, you could go ahead and simply say no to allow users to choose. And then with PC over IP as their only option, we gain some options regarding 3D rendering. So the way that most people are going to roll this out is they're going to get it, first of all, up and running and functioning, and then they'll get the optimization documents and go ahead and start fine-tuning for their individual requirements. And if we said yes to allow the user to choose between PC over IP and RDP, then the option for 3D rendering becomes disabled. So as we go down further in the list, we have the number of monitors, the max resolution of any single monitor, whether or not HTML access is enabled or not. And as we scroll to the bottom, we have some options for Adobe as well as for Mirage. So the changes that you and I are going to make are that we're going to automatically log off a user after 5 minutes, and we're going to allow the users to reset their machines, and we'll leave everything else at their defaults. And we'll click on Next. Next, we're going to go ahead and specify which virtual machines are going to be associated with this Horizon View pool, this manual pool. So because those machines already have to exist, and we only have one vCenter server to play with, let's go ahead and grab VM22. I'm going to hold down the Control key and 23. So those are both selected. We could also use the Shift key option to get an entire range of virtual machines. And I'm going to click on Add. So VM22 and 23 are going to be part of this engineering pool. And we'll click on Next. Next is asking us about the advanced storage options and do we want to use the storage accelerator, yes or no. I'm going to say yes. And then by default, it's going to regenerate the storage accelerator after 7 days. Now, regarding that regeneration, we might want to avoid regenerating during peak times, like Monday morning at 8 o'clock, or at other times of the day when we have high demands on our systems. So we could also set out blackout times where during those times it should not perform a regeneration to work around the blackout times. So we'll click on Next to continue. It gives us a summary of what it's about to do, and then we'll go ahead and click on Finish. Now check this out. We have this new pool that's called Engineering Dash Pool. And as we look over here to the right, you'll notice that it currently says 0 are entitled. That means it's a beautiful pool. It's got 2 virtual machines as part of this manual pool, but no users and or groups are yet entitled to be able to use those resources. So if we want to entitle some users, we're going to highlight this pool, select it, and then click on Entitlements and give permissions, if you will, entitlements for individual users and or groups to use this pool. So we'll select our pool to begin with. We'll click on the Entitlements button, and then from the drop-down, we'll select Add Entitlement. And just as expected, we have no entitlements by default, but we'll click on Add. And because the connection server is a member of Active Directory and has access to look at Active Directory, we can go ahead and choose from our Active Directory objects, including users and groups. So for example, if we're only looking for groups, we could deselect users and we could narrow it down. For example, we could type in domain, press enter, and it would search for any groups that have the word domain in it. And there's our domain users right here at the bottom. Or we could have typed in domain users and it would have filtered down just to the domain users group. So we'll select domain users as the group that we want to entitle. We'll click on OK. And now domain users is entitled, or will be once we finish the wizard, will be entitled to use the resources in this pool called Engineering Pool. So we'll click on OK. And you'll notice over here we now have entitled 1, meaning there's one object that's entitled. That's the domain users group. So now if Bob or Lois or somebody else tries to use resources in this pool, as long as they are a validated member of that group called domain users, they will be entitled, quote unquote, to use the resources, the VMs, that are associated with this Horizon View pool. So to create a second pool and a third pool, it would work just the same. We'll click on Add. We'll go a little faster this time. We're going to create a manual desktop pool referring to VMs that already exist. We'll click on Next. They'll be dedicated to users, and there'll be automatic assignment for the first time users connect. We'll click on Next. The VMs are managed by vCenter. We'll click on Next. There's our one and only vCenter server, so we'll go ahead and have that selected and click on Next. And let's call this pool Sales Pool. And give it a display name with Sales Pool as well, and we'll click on Next. We'll specify that we're going to log these people off after 5 minutes of being disconnected, and give them the permission to reboot their computer, their virtual desktop if they need to. We'll click on Next. And from our list of available VMs, let's go ahead and grab VM26. And I'll hold down the Control key or the Shift key because they're right next to each other, and click on VM27. And with them both selected, we'll click on Add. And they both get added to the list. We'll click on Next. We can choose to use the View Storage Accelerator as well here or not based on that checkbox. We'll click on Next. We'll review the summary, and then we'll go ahead and click on Finish. Now, there was in that wizard a little checkbox in the upper corner that says, do you want to go ahead and automatically entitle this pool after you're finished? And if we had clicked that checkbox, it would have automatically taken us to the entitlement wizard. Because I didn't select that, we're going to go ahead and click on the Sales Pool, click on Entitlements, Add Entitlement. We'll click on Add. We'll go ahead and look for Domain Users. There's one group that matches that. We'll select it, click on OK again. And now, as long as the user trying to access resources in either of these pools is a member of domain users, they will be entitled to use those resources. And we very easily could have, in Active Directory, have separate groups, one for sales, one for engineering, and have different entitlements here in View as well to match that. So that the right people, based on Active Directory and group membership, can have access to the correct resources inside of Horizon View. In this nugget, we've taken a look at how we can, in Horizon View, organize existing virtual machines into manual pools, and then control by granting entitlement to select which users can use which resources in those pools. I appreciate you joining me for this nugget. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.